Welcome to a really important lesson on NEAT, non-exercise activity time, and what I endearingly call becoming a NEAT freak. Maybe not the kind of NEAT freak that you associate with in your mind now, but to become a non-exercise activity time committed person. A NEAT freak can do wonders to help you achieve your life goals of wellness, your why, quality of life, and even quantity of life. Let me emphasize again that when it comes to the healthiest populations on earth, those that have achieved the longest life with the least disease, we see that it is high levels of low intensity to moderate intensity physical activity, high amounts of low to moderate intensity activity that's the most associated with longevity. Not the type of intense, anxiety-provoking exercise that we see being pushed around quite a bit and described as the best and the most beneficial. Not that I'm against brisk exercise in the right balance. I certainly am for that. But it's got to be in the right balance, and it is commonly thought of as the pinnacle of health when in fact the best data shows us the longest living people are involved in high levels of activity, but at low to moderate intensity. Okinawa, Japan, the Nicoya Peninsula of Costa Rica, Sardinia, Italy. In fact, I'll show you some pictures from Sardinia from my trip there during this session. Okay? So our first low-lying fruit that I can give you is every bit of physical activity counts, even outside the gym, and even that activity that does not induce a sweat, almost anything that will get you up and out of your chair, even, frankly, standing. But for reasons we've discussed, it's a good idea to make a significant amount of that getting out of chair, some type of movement. Even if not able to, from a stationary position, get away from the computer, then alternating, as you see me moving up and down, sitting and standing every so often. In fact, the American Diabetes Association is going to make the argument no more than 30 minutes of chronic sitting without doing something for 5 minutes. I could basically summarize it by them saying, at least kick your legs. There's so much evidence that chronic sitting, being broken up into any level of physical activity, is helpful, because muscle has been found to be if you will, what have you done for me lately, part of the body, a what have you done for me lately tissue. It seems that the muscle becomes insulin resistant or begins that process not long after chronic sitting, of 30 minutes even. So we're not saying get up out of a chair at the movie and freak out standing every few minutes throughout the movie, unless you want to have someone throwing junk food at the back of your head. We're not saying stand up even though the pilot is saying sit down. Of course, be realistic about this. But we really should be trying to get from the 7 hours on average the American sits per day to about half of that, and then breaking up sitting as often as reasonably possible with levels of activity and things that you can do during the day you would be surprised are so easy. You just didn't know how valuable they were. So I hope by the end of this lesson you do. The timing of movement matters. Breaking up movement throughout the day is helpful. As a matter of fact, I want to give you an example of a study that led the American Diabetes Association to urge moving at least every 30 minutes for 5 minutes. And the rigidity of that recommendation I would ask you to disregard, because really that becomes an obsessive compulsive disorder that's based on a guideline that's a synthesis of data that gets a group of averages into a falsely defined point. In other words, you're not likely going to be measuring on a timer 30 minutes ding and then move around every 5 minutes, or move around for 5 minutes for every 30 minutes of chronic sitting. But you will, I hope, be motivated to find ways to simply break up your sitting time. You'll know that it's less. You know what you're doing now, if you're not already a NEAT freak. And you'll know that it will be significantly less than before as we go through these lessons and teachings that we hope provide insight and motivation to do so. So the American Diabetes Association has a recommendation, as we now have said, no more than 30 minutes of sitting whenever possible, complemented by 5 minutes of movement for every 30 minutes of that sitting. We'll just not worry about the rigidity of it, but we get the idea. Here's one of the studies that led to that conclusion. Uncontrolled diabetics were put into one of 3 groups to see which would help their after-dinner blood sugar the best. Okay? One group was asked to continue to sit because they wanted to have a comparison group. Another group was essentially asked to exercise briskly for about 45 minutes, 5 days per week in the morning. And the other group was asked to simply walk mildly for 15 minutes within 30 minutes of completing dinner. So I ask you, which group do you think had the best blood sugar after dinner? Obviously, it wasn't the group that made no change, but was it the group that was exercising much more intensely for triple the amount of time in the morning, or those that took a mild to moderate 15-minute walk within 30 minutes of completing dinner? Now, as I'm a doctor, not a lawyer, and I would be probably a terrible lawyer as I've led the witness completely, you can probably already guess that it was the 15-minute mild walk within 30 minutes of completing dinner. What does that tell you? Muscle is a very what have you done for me lately tissue. And when it comes to diabetes prevention, and likely many things associated with diabetes, whether it's dementia or stroke or cancer or heart attack, you've got to think about this. I'm not saying don't exercise in the morning. I would argue do both. Do both. They have different ways of helping our body be healthy. Different ways. Structured exercise for a limited amount of time, plus being a neat freak and taking every opportunity, even those that do not induce a sweat at all, to be active, or at least to not be chronically sitting for 7, 8, or more hours per day, trying to get that down without necessarily measuring it to something more along the lines of 3 hours per day, for instance. Sardinia. These pictures weren't taken long ago. About 2011, I had a chance to fly to Sardinia and be part of a film called The Embrace of Aging that was produced by a multiple Michigan Emmy Award winning documentary film producer, Keith Famey. The back of which you see there as I took that picture, that he was able to have a film capture, spontaneous, of 2 Sardinian shepherds, as you see, whether they were goat or sheep shepherds or both, I don't know, but you see them in their classic walking stick, hats on, walking down the mountain, just part of their day. That's just what they do. Light to moderate levels of physical activity. You can imagine in the mountains of Sardinia, you kind of got a treadmill that has these up and down levels of inclination built right into your world. They don't think about it though. They're just active throughout the day. Do they exercise? No, they don't think of it as exercise. Do they even take supplements? When I asked them that, they laughed in my face and said no. Look at the reflections of their being gardeners as well. The rows of onions. We were on the farm that we were invited to this shepherd's lunch. As you can look in the bottom left, they weren't just talking about serving fruit for dessert. The most consistent dessert of longevity societies is fresh fruit. There you see chopped up watermelon, chopped up honeydew right from their garden, right on the table. Humble but healthy. And of course you see hand-washed clothes drying on the balcony of an apartment. Where do you see that these days? I mean, you have to go to some rerun of Leave It to Beaver to see anybody that's actually hand-washing clothes. So my point isn't to become a goat herder or sheep shepherd or to start washing your clothes by hand. But my point is to take every opportunity to build natural movement into your lifestyle. It is very, very beneficial. In fact, I would say that based on only 23% or so of Americans, despite us pounding it into everyone's head to exercise regularly, less than 25% are actually doing so. Maybe the smarter thing is to look at the power of becoming a non-exercise activity person and taking some of the suggestions we'll have in a moment here to do so. All right? So we've mentioned all of these things. Let's repeat them as repetition is the mother of learning. Trying to get to more like 3 hours or less per day. for your sitting time. You won't necessarily need to measure this, but the concept is try to cut your sitting back by half if you're anywhere near the average American sitting about 7 hours a day. Many sitting more than that, because remember, if the average is 7, there's many on the end of the bell curve sitting more than that. Trying to break up chronic sitting with something, whether it's standing or moving, about every 20, 30 minutes. My body says within 10 to 15 minutes, but everyone's different. There's many times I'll be sitting in a meeting and I'll say, excuse me, and I'll just have to stand up. My body just thrusts me up. You can feel it. In fact, if you start to fidget, many in the metabolic world would say that's the sign that your body wants to move. You might even just say, look, I stand during meetings and I take breaks sitting rather than the opposite, which is to sit and then take breaks standing. All legitimate. When it comes to 10,000 steps, the next bullet point, we're going to talk about a story, at least in terms of how we got to 10,000 steps, which was really the first, basically, pedometer was invented in Japan by someone who named that pedometer in what would translate in Japanese to 10,000 steps. Is there magic behind it otherwise? Not really. There is something to be said about how that number ironically came up and isn't necessarily that far off. I think it's been estimated that Okinawans in their natural movement was to have about 9,000 steps or so per day. And a recent study on mortality, which isn't quality of life, just length of life, saw a flat line, the most benefit being at around 7,000 steps, and then after that, when it came to death, not much extra benefit, at least in older women. But that doesn't mean that improved quality of life can't be enhanced by more. I certainly know that in terms of my mood and my mental energy, I'm better off closer to the 10,000 step mark, although taking a break some days. That's an average. You get 18,000 steps in a day and your feet hurt, so get less the next day. It's the average. Remember, realistic. Avoid rigidity. It's consistency that matters most, not intensity of adherence, but consistency of overall adherence. Okay? And we've discussed, and I'll repeat again, the answer to chronic sitting is probably not just chronic standing. There is actually evidence, despite the risks, that it's certainly less bad in terms of metabolic health to be standing chronically than sitting, but the problem is it'd be better if you can find some movement to replace sitting, not just make all of it standing, because of the pooling of blood in the legs that can aggravate varicose veins, for instance, the arches of your feet that will become strained, although there's ways to mitigate that with good footwear and a nice standing foot pad, and I would still encourage those. Still, chronically standing has issues, including posture, where you start to become humped over, and then your neck strain can occur, and so therefore alternating sitting and standing probably best. And remember, we discussed, and you saw some graphs from two high-quality studies from decades apart and continents apart, published in the same highly respected American Journal of Clinical Nutrition, that chronic sitting likely aggravates appetite, as does in brisk, heavy physical activity. So the irony is that if you exercise really heavy in the morning and you sit all day long, or you sit all day long and exercise heavy in the evening just before dinner and wonder why you can't control your appetite, you're not in that sweet spot where breaking up physical activity with light to moderate intensity, non-exercise opportunities may actually decrease appetite. Okay? Think about that. In fact, if you exercise rather briskly, good for you, you might want to counter the appetite aggravation beyond not allowing yourself to get to the starving hunger dragon level by being a neat freak, non-exercise activity time freak. So here are some suggestions just to get the juices rolling and the food for thought, right? Parking at a distance for things you do regularly. Going to the grocery store, going even to the gym. You might have seen some of my videos on why I still park far from the gym. Anything that you routinely do, weather permitting and practicality permitting, to make it more of a rule that you'll park at a distance and prevent yourself from getting door dings on your car. By the way, only half of a joke. It's actually true to a good degree. To make parking at a distance a commitment. Alternating sitting standing desks, many different brands. I'm not going to endorse one. I can assure you, you can do a search and find many different options to have an alternating sitting standing desk. If you say, Dr. Tom, I am just committed to my screen. I just can't move. My job depends on it. Okay. And if you have to wear certain footwear, high heels and so forth, it's okay. Wear that to work, but keep some nice standing shoes in your office, and you can switch them. If there's a will, there's a way. All right? Find and take stairs. They are the lonely friends that you have sitting in a hotel, sitting at work and in malls. Find them, use them. And if you have 10 flights up, you don't have to go 10 flights up. You can start, maybe never have to go 10 flights up. But you can start by just going to the 8th or 9th floor on the elevator and then going up 1 or 2. And maybe you'll actually get yourself to the point where you occasionally actually take all 10 flights up. And sometimes you may skip it for a 5% fun zone and give yourself a break and take the elevator. That's what lifestyle is all about. It's not about rigidity. It's about discipline without extremism, but to shift the overall average towards moving and commitment to movement outside of the gym. In addition to it, or frankly, if you're going to pick one or the other, the gym or being a neat freak, you force me into that corner, I'd rather say do both, but I would say leverage your neat freak. That's where the consistency of longevity data is. Okay? Walk and talk. While you've got a call, take it walking if you're not stuck. If it's on the cell phone, you've got a nice long hallway or a place you can walk around wherever you work, in a facility or otherwise, walk and talk. Meetings that you can possibly have with a small group that you can walk and talk, or even, I guess, standing meetings, of course. Walking lunch, make it a regular thing a few times per week, maybe on a regular basis. I've had staff members that have done that. They've made lunch their walk and talk time. While waiting for appointments. These aren't things you do regularly, but they're opportunities. I can't forget a story at the Secretary of State where they came up with the technology to tell me when my number was coming up by text. And then after telling me this and saying that they would text me within 2 or 3 minutes of my number coming up and then ask me to sit down with a group of 50 people that looked pretty depressed while it was a beautiful spring day outside. And I thought to myself, why would I do that? You're going to text me when I've got plenty of time to come back. I'm going to go outside and take a walk for the 40 minutes instead of sitting around. Same thing when it comes to the airport. If you can get there early instead of taking the conveyor belt or the tram, walk wherever reasonably possible. You're waiting for your flight, walk around. There are so many opportunities. All you need to do is be convinced how much it serves your health and your why, and that this cannot be replaced by exercise. The amount of exercise that would have to be done to justify chronically sitting all day long is way more, maybe on the order of 90 minutes of intense exercise a day, most days per week. Not going to happen. Certainly not going to happen for me. Then, yes, we'll discuss in other lessons, you seal the deal with exercise. That would be the ultimate wrap-up. The neat freak is the cake, the exercise is the icing. Okay? And that is your lesson here.